And welcome back, fellow American patriots, to the one and only CR podcast. Your host, Daniel Horowitz, here on this fine Tuesday to discuss the issues that matter to America and that are important to your lives, your communities. And what more important issue than the nature and composition of your neighborhood and holding its integrity from this assault and invasion of Section 8 Ghettostone, as I call it, where we have endless federal funds funneled to local and state housing authorities to give off to their crony developers so they can earn a fortune, get exempt from property taxes, and fill your community with a demographic change the culture of Western lands. We're going to talk about Wyoming today with a special guest who uncovered a degree of low income housing scam that is changing the orientation of Wyoming, but really many other states and cities and communities in a way that is just as bad as the Somali childcare welfare scam in Minneapolis. As I've noted before, this is not just a Somali immigration issue, although that's certainly big. It's not just daycare, it's Medicaid, it's housing, it's all of it. It's all a symptom of an open ended welfare entitlement state where the feds print inflationary money that we all pay for so that basically at a local and state level, a bunch of Democrats and rhinos could cement their incumbency by getting elected with special interests and then paying them off, whether it's the healthcare sector, it's the hospitals, or with housing, it's these land developers. So that's what we're going to get to today. The Somali scam was really just the tip of the iceberg. And this is why I'm going to keep drumming this home. If we had a sane Republican Party, they would use budget reconciliation yet again to devolve all welfare programs to the states. Honestly, they're already running it in terms of the scams and fraud. You may as well make states sink or swim on their own volition without consumers suffering from federally printed money that they just use to enrich their cronies. You will never get a better political tailwind than these fraud scandals for Trump to push something like this. Will they bite? Probably not. But who knows? So, anyway, we're going to do a very deep dive with our friend from Wyoming today. First, because I'm going to do a lot of these deep dives, we're not going to have enough time to get to a lot of smaller stories of the day that are still important. So that's why I ask you guys to subscribe right here. You could put your phone up against this QR code to my Substack, Daniel Horowitz Substack. If you're listening, just Google it. Also, make sure to like and subscribe on my YouTube page at Horowitz Show. In the future, we will be posting more graphics, but we are trying to build up the page so we could punch through the algorithmic slop and just this other nonsense that we're seeing, focusing on the issues that don't matter. Now, before we get into our guest segment, which is the main part today with housing, very closely related is data centers. Again, this is all part of the assault on American land, Western land, Section 8, green energy, data centers, and they all don't pay property taxes, by the way. Interesting. We'll talk about that. But interestingly enough, President Trump, out of nowhere, put out on Truth Social last night that Microsoft will make major changes beginning this week to ensure Americans don't pay for their power consumption in the form of higher utility bills. So we went from denying this is a problem, that attacking any states and localities that wanted to put restrictions on it, to saying, hey, actually, you're right. Yeah, this thing is taking out a lot of energy. and we're going to make them pay for it. Now, that's a step in the right direction. This is good. At least he's getting the message that this is a big political issue he's going to get crushed on. But I would just note that it's quite hard for them to actually pay for it. It's one thing for them to promise to do it, another thing for them to actually do it. Um, in December alone, data center load accounted for 40% of PJM capacity auctions. Okay, 40%. PJM, for those of you who are not in the Midwest or the Mid Atlantic, that is the largest grid operator in America. So if data centers are accounting for 40% of their capacity auctions, I would love to see how we suddenly have enough power for that. I'm all for that, by the way. But if we have such power, then how come we haven't been deploying it to lower rising electricity rates the last 4 or 5 years? That's first of all. Second of all, I want to bring to you a Financial Times article. I want to bring to your attention here um, that just shows this whole lie of the data center cloud based AGI generative AI slop model. Microsoft leader has claimed that US artificial intelligence groups are being outpaced by Chinese rivals in the battle for users outside the West. The Financial Times reported on Tuesday, Chinese experts said the claims reflect growing anxiety among US tech firms and their attempt to smear Chinese AI with subsidy claims. And basically, what they're saying is that Africa and other countries are adopting Chinese startup DeepSeek's technology rather than OpenAI and the American companies. And there's a reason for it, folks. There's a huge, huge reason for it. This is from again, the Financial Times article. China's open source approach is another key advantage, Chen said, as it offers greater data sovereignty and flexibility for customization. Unlike closed Western models that limit users to paid APIs, Chinese open source models allow local deployment and modification, easing data security concerns and enabling startups to build local language solutions while retaining control over core technologies. China's large AI models not only match their US counterparts in performance at much lower cost, but can also run on very affordable hardware, making them hard to turn down. Toyin, an entrepreneur for Abuja, Nigeria, told the Global Times in a previous interview. So let me ask you a question. How is China succeeding in selling their products everywhere with a fraction of the data centers we have? The answer is because they're building it smarter and cheaper. See, if you build trillion-dollar infrastructure for this, well, then you got to make back your money. You're not going to make it up on these, small monthly subscriptions. That's the reality. Their AI is much more lean and nimble. I'm not against AI. I'm arguing that the data center cloud-based model is misallocating resources away from more efficient AI models. But that's the question. Why are we approaching this data center model at all when China is doing it better without that? And the answer is just like we're going to see with housing and any government policy, Stargate, it's all a grift to pay off their cronies and basically build this symbiotic relationship between these private vendor organizations and government officials. This is from Semaphore. Meta hires ex-Trump advisor to oversee AI build-out. Meta is signaling a deeper push into the Gulf's AI race with a high-profile hire with close ties to the region. The company tapped former Trump advisor Dina Powell, McCormick, as president and vice chair, responsible for overseeing a planned 600 billion infrastructure build out over the next decade. And the move suggests Meta could follow peers such as Google, Nvidia, and OpenAI in striking partnerships in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and UAE. Now, here's the deal, folks. Dina Powell is wife to Senator McCormick from Pennsylvania. McCormick is the big advocate to make Pennsylvania a parking lot for data centers. So again, the companies appoint the wives of senators and governors that are pushing for their pet projects. This is why we have no free market. It's all venture socialism. It's pathetic. And what happens when you have venture socialism, whether it's in technology, whether it's in welfare and housing, like we're going to talk about in a few moments, what happens is you don't get efficiencies. You don't achieve the best outcomes for the cheapest price because you don't need to, because you have government doing the work for you. Well, actually, we're doing it. We're paying for it in inflation. And by the way, I'm sick of the gaslighting. Today they came out with CPI numbers and they're like, yeah, the core CPI was 2.6% instead of 2.7% expected. It's cooling. No. The fact that we're still adding 2.6% on top of this insane plateau is crazy. Put another way, we have now gone 58 consecutive months. 58 consecutive months with above target inflation, target being 2%, which in itself is gaslighting the American people that going up 2% compounding ad infinitum is somehow normal. Really, we should have deflation for most products. So that's a complete grift right there to sit and call that cooling of inflation. No, it's not. But I digress. Anyway, Florida has a bill, HB 1007. I want you guys to copy this down, mirror it for your state, get your elected reps in the legislature to introduce it. This basically is a piece of legislation to serve as a vehicle for Governor DeSantis's data center bill. The bill would basically establish a state policy that local governments are encouraged and empowered to protect residents against all negative effects of data centers. It would prohibit utilities from passing down the costs to customers, and it would prohibit local governments from allowing data centers in mixed land use categories. Plus, data center approvals by local government would require concurrence by the governor and his cabinet, among many other things. So you would get the lowest common denominator of both. In other words, either a locality could block it or the state could block it. Put another way, you need the approval of both to get it passed. This is the opposite direction we've seen from West Virginia, Ohio, Indiana, Pennsylvania, but this is the direction we need to move in. And look, the president himself said he agrees today. So this is how you show it, not by banning states from actually implementing this stuff, from implementing these regulations. One other quick story before we introduce our guest, and I think this is actually a good tie-in. Amy Meck just put this out. We had one of her colleagues on from the Rare Foundation. They're fighting the Islamization of America. Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, America's heartland. Again, we have this assault on America's heartland. The data centers, the green energy, Ghettostone, and these mega mosques from the Muslim Brotherhood. So there was a Muslim Brotherhood associated mosque that was submitting plans before the Broken Arrow Council to get their expansion approved, and local citizens turned out en masse. And they defeated it 4-1. And I'm telling you, folks, I bring this up not just to highlight the importance of well, the threat of the Islamization and the importance of blocking it. But I also want to shed light on positive developments. I know, we I'm called the prophet of woe and lamentation. I give you guys a lot of negative stories, but to me, the most positive potential that really blows past some of these rigid, fake ideological lines and these Twitter tribalism distinctions of people that just want to preserve their communities. And it seems so daunting at a national level to fight anything. But you could fight civilization issues, not just garbage collection times, things like that, at a local level. And when you assemble a neighborhood of people, you'd be shocked at what you could accomplish. And we're seeing it with all of these issues that the more people are alerted to this, social transformation without representation taking place in their communities, the more they stand up to it and often succeed. Because as much as these local officials are often bought out, if the entire town is yelling at you, it's a lot more close and personal as our founders envisioned representative democracy at the lowest level. It matters to them. You have a congressman, 800,000 person district, you get a couple of angry calls, it's not going to do much. But city council, state legislature, this is where it's at, folks. So we're going to be highlighting a lot more stories like this as the year progresses. And one big one, of course, is our next guest in Wyoming. So, folks, one thing we learned from the Somali welfare scam in Minnesota is that when you have an open ended entitlement state built upon endless inflationary printed money that we all wind up suffering for, it not only creates dependency and, creates a hammock instead of a hand up for the impoverished, but it enriches private companies. You see, in America, we are so capitalistic that we make capitalism off of socialism that I often like to call venture socialism. So rather than just straight up a handout, Medicaid, the child care stuff we saw, and housing, low income housing tax credits, they're funneled through state and local housing authorities, faceless, nameless bureaucrats that often work in the housing industry themselves and cycle in and out of these developing developer corporations. And then they pass on endless funds because they don't have to balance their budget because they get the money straight from the feds, and they pay off their cronies who in turn donate to them. And this is how the Democrats and the rhinos gain footholds in conservative areas, but also how they saddle us with Ghettostone. And we've seen this really three-headed beast: data centers, green energy, and Section 8 Ghettostone gobbling up Western lands in places like Wyoming, changing the heritage, the character of neighborhoods. And it's not just Wyoming, it's really everywhere, all the while showering the tenants with these lavish subsidies that often they themselves don't see, but the developers get. And all the while, they're supposed to be stewards of a not for profit welfare program when in fact they make a profit. And in fact, they often rent it to people who aren't eligible. So they double dip getting market value rent plus the government subsidies. Oh, and then to add insult to injury, just like with the data centers, just like with some of the green energy projects, they don't pay property taxes. So imagine when we talk about farms and ranches disappearing, that sucking sound, that tilting, tendentious treatment away from market forces by the government, that if you want to maintain a ranch, you got to pay sales tax on everything, property tax. You don't get any of these special favors. But in the housing industry, you do. So you know what? It's naturally going to move the land more into these projects. And, this is the opportunity with all these scams to push wholesale welfare reform, to devolve this to the states where you won't just be the steward of the program, but you'll pay for it now and be responsible, and states don't have a printing press. The problem now is when you have the federal printing press and the locals running it and funneling it through their cronies. This is how you get the Somali scam times 100 in every state, in every program. But it's particularly pernicious with housing because it's also changing and altering the character of our neighborhoods, our communities, and particularly heartbreaking in Western lands. And by the way, that's why, if you've noticed, every time we want to reform something, let's say Medicaid, we have this debate over Medicaid expansion. You don't find a million man poor person march in the streets opposing it. It's all the private vendors that grift off of it. They're the ones that lobby. So hospitals are kind of similar. Oh, they're not for profit, except they're the most profitable ventures around. They're the ones that milk Medicaid. So think of these housing developers that are the vendors for these local and state housing authorities funded through HUD. Think of them as sort of the hospital system that they grift off of it. And just like with healthcare, the quality of the housing diminishes. It doesn't help anyone. It harms the neighborhood and it lines their pockets. There is someone who has blown the lid off of this in Wyoming, but I'm telling you, it's happening in some form everywhere. And I want to invite her on, Rebecca Bextel. She is a super conservative activist in Wyoming, out in Teton County. She has a very important website. I want you guys to see the Open Range Record. A lot of what we're going to discuss, you could find the original sourcing there. And she holds town halls at a local level, invites local officials to blow the lid off of this housing scam, this housing scandal. Really an exercise in what local activism needs to look like. By the way, she also is a Teton County GOP state committee woman and ran for state party chair, lost by what, 10 votes?
Yes.
Rebecca, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Daniel.
Man, there is so much to discuss. I want to turn it over to you here. You started in this venture, exposing it to the grassroots, this circuitous housing scam, when all of a sudden you saw in this trend that I call Ghettostone, social transformation without representation, the rodeo and fairgrounds of Teton County. This is Yellowstone. This is one of the most beautiful parts of the country. And you saw this low income housing complex being built there. What raised your ire about it, and what did you discover?
Well, I couldn't understand how we were going to give up 10% of the remaining historic Teton County fairgrounds, which the town of Jackson's owned since 1941. It's a beautiful story of how that property came to be owned by the town of Jackson. And it was supposed to be for the benefit of everyone living in Teton County. So we had 2,500 locals sign a petition. 10,000 emails were sent to the county commissioners and town council saying, please don't move forward with this project. We had hundreds of people packing out town halls. And eventually you start looking around and saying something here is not making any sense. It's not the will of the people to do this project, as the town didn't even follow their own zoning rules. They pulled so many fast ones on us. And then after the project was built, I decided to start looking into who got paid.
So you started to look into who got paid, because it's not like you had thousands of people lining the streets there that were homeless and suddenly needed housing. It was gaslit that we need to build this here. Well, typically when there's a need for something, there is profitability. It makes sense. But here there are no market forces. You have open-ended funding. So describe what you found in terms of this low-income housing tax credit, how it functions, how it's dispersed, and how it encourages not an efficient way of dealing with people who can't afford housing, but an efficient way of lining the pockets of people who don't want to compete in a free market.
Well, you hit it right, Daniel. There wasn't a lot of necessarily low-income people showing up advocating for this. We really had one face on this locally, a guy named Tyler Davis. And his father-in-law owned all these restaurants in town. Later, and he was the face of the concerned citizen movement. You know, he would show up at town council meetings, the state land board, and just sit there and say, we need low-income housing. But I found in the contracts where he got paid 33% of $1 million to push it through. Okay. So it's like there's always someone getting paid. And of course, now, you know, we're told we've got to house the low income workforce. But when I public record requested who lived in the building, of course, 3 of his father-in-law's restaurants employees, Joe Rice's employees. But then we had major companies like TJ Maxx, United Airlines, Spring Hill Suites, Four Seasons, Budget Rental Car. And so what I found was we were literally subsidizing some of the wealthiest corporations in America with $5 billion in profits a year and calling that low-income housing. I also found where we literally imported people, and that's I know a topic that you've been hammering. We imported residents from California, Arizona to live here in Teton County in low-income housing. So they're redesigning who lives in Jackson. But basically,
again, if this wasn't necessary, there is an organic need for it. Instead, it's the tail wagging the dog, where they had to import people to be a facade for free government funding that these guys, enrich their cronies with.
It took 6 months to fill up the building. I can see where the developers would email the housing authority, say, help, we can't find, we have no one applying for these units. And they literally just started importing people at that point. So speaking of the low-income housing tax credit program, and Daniel, this is in all 50 states, okay? Now, you know, some of the differences are, in my case, my Wyoming, so it's a HUD program facilitated by a state authority, which is chock full of unelected bureaucrats that are in charge of passing out literally millions of dollars a year. They pass out millions here in Wyoming. I can't imagine what they're in charge of in a place like New York or California or Illinois. So we've got these unelected bureaucrats picking the winners and losers, of course. Here in my state, I found out where we had almost a revolving door. So a guy, his name is Christian Pritchett. He owns the largest company that does this in Wyoming. They're called Blue Line Development. He used to work for the WCDA. So Christian was the federal programs coordinator, now turned federal programs recipient. And these programs basically just pump in millions of dollars. According to a Cato Institute testimony, just this in 2025 in May, they actually said that arguably, they said this in front of the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee, arguably the middlemen in these programs receive more of a gain than the intended recipients. There's another excellent article. I've got it linked on openrangerecord.com, and it talks about how there's a ravenous group of middlemen that take a bite at the apple. By my estimates, in every state, at least 6 different folks are getting paid off from start to finish just to get it approved through the state process. Really wrap your head around that one.
So that's the thing here. Again, we're all for state and local control, but that would be if they had a capped budget. The problem is the federal printing presses that throw the money at them. So they have no incentive to do this efficiently to meet the need. And in fact, because it's an open-ended entitlement, it winds up enriching all their cronies. So one of the things they seem to do is that they inflate soft costs and construction budgets to maximize the government payouts to basically build garbage. Mm-hmm. But they maximize their budgets. Describe what you're seeing, how, you know, typically in a real private sector, not a venture socialist private sector with public funds being unnaturally funneled to private entities. So typically it's the lowest, most efficient, effective bid that wins out. But in fact, here it's the opposite, because if you're working in a local housing authority, which often means you are working for one of these developers, you're going to shovel it to the highest payout, right?
That's right. So what's going on is, in our case in Teton County, there were 2 groups that were going to build this supposed low-income housing. And by the way, Daniel, the kick in the teeth is if you read the contracts, everything we were told is it has to be people making less than 60% of AMI, but the contracts actually say if their income goes up at that point, they just start paying fair market rent. You can't kick someone out. It says it's expressed in the contracts for having too high of an income. In other words, we're spending millions of dollars. In many cases, we're taking public land. In our case, the fairgrounds is considered a park. It used to be called Elena Hunt Park. And we're basically enriching these East Coast equity owners of these buildings. I saw a case in Casper where the city thought they were donating a $1.25 million piece of property, which President Grover Cleveland gave to the city in 1897. They thought they were donating that to the local housing authority. But when I got my hands on the paperwork and I looked at the deed, it's actually owned by Boston Financial through an LLC. So it's called Liberty Square Apartments LLC, and Boston Financial owns 99.9% of that. In the town, you'll watch video of the town council saying, we want to support low-income housing. We're going to take a $654,000 hit on this land. All they've done is enrich. By the way, guess who owns Boston Financial? $16 billion firm, a $94 billion Japanese firm. We literally have complexes all over Wyoming owned by Japanese private equity firms. So another thing that I discovered is a lot of times these buildings don't pay property tax. What authority does the Wyoming Community Development Authority or the local housing director have to literally put in a contract that they're exempt from property tax? We've got senior citizens all over Wyoming, just like in America, that are struggling to pay their property tax. And yet these aren't even constituents in the state getting a free ride. In the building in Jackson, there's 38 kids living there. We pay $20,000 a student. Who's going to pay that?
That's a big deal, because right now a big source of contention nationwide is the property tax issue, with land appreciation going crazy since COVID. You have the Florida governor that's trying to fight to get rid of, or at least severely diminish, property taxes on homesteads because of this, because you'll have people just paying the rest of their lives an ever increasing price, which is much greater than relative to the price they paid. But you're telling me you'll have these land developers that are totally for profit. Mm-hmm. Kind of reminds me again of the hospitals that say they're not for profit, right, but then they make a ton of money off of Medicaid, but then they don't pay taxes. You're telling me they gobble up a bunch of land. So remember, ranches are dying in Wyoming. It's a big problem. And they're consumed by property tax. But if you gobble up that land, just like with the data centers, just like with a lot of these wind projects, you gobble it up for low-income housing, it's treated kind of like a public good, except it's owned by a private company earning a profit off of it.
Another way to say it is, you don't get a property tax exemption for helping your own poor self, okay? If your husband died and you all of a sudden are a single mother with kids and you all of a sudden are thrown into poverty, you don't get an exemption on your property tax. But a private East Coast equity firm who owns housing to help the poor, they get an exemption for helping the poor. That doesn't make any sense to me. And frankly, I believe that's actually not what the Wyoming statutes say, which is why I'm hosting these town halls. I'm putting the assessors on record. Another thing that you mentioned is you talked about inflated costs. So I'm currently in the process of suing the town of Jackson. A building that I identified here, they're all over the place, but in this particular one that's located on the fairgrounds, I see where they say that the building costs $19 million in construction costs and $4 million in other costs. Now that's where the developer paid himself $1 million in tax funds. But the town, they'll send me the 2021 budget for the building that was built in 2023. My attorneys go back and say, wait a minute, there's no way you knew what in 2021 what the actual costs were. They don't want you to get your hands on these costs. Okay. Now I just saw another contract in our town. It's some more employee or low income housing, and the same developer, Blue Line, paid themselves $2 million, which was 5% of the construction costs. But then I see where the architect made 6% and somehow only got paid $1.2 million. Do the math on that one, Daniel. So the architect gets 6% construction costs. They get paid $1.2 million. The private developer makes 5% of construction costs, somehow paid themselves $2 million. I'm still getting to the bottom of that one. In Wyoming, we're the only state that seems to really be hiding. Now, in Teton County, I've gotten the numbers because they know I'm serious in this county. But I've tried a public record request straight from HUD, straight from the WCDA facilitator, the Wyoming Community Development Authority, what these consultants and developers are paid on these projects, and they will not give it up. And there's a reason why. We're going to find that arguably the middlemen receive more of a benefit than the low income recipient, who now we know doesn't even have to be low income to live there. It's awful.
And everyone knows that with Section 8 in general, the amount that the government pumps in is just absurd. And especially at a time where everyone else is suffering from the high cost of inflation. And again, I'm going to drive this home. This is why you cannot have venture socialism where you have open-ended entitlements funneled through private entities that have every motive to earn a profit, therefore every motive to buy off the stewards of those programs with campaign favors, so they're elected, and then the companies are kept fat and happy. We got to find a way to make them sink or swim on their own volition and cap this. So I do want to get to solutions, but still, when we're just going through the scope of the problem, a big point of contention is not just the tax subsidies and how much they wind up siphoning off for themselves as opposed to the tenants. There's also zoning that, because this is, I want to zoom out a little bit. If you live in Wyoming, but I know most of you guys in any suburb you're living in, we could debate when zoning becomes overzealous, when it doesn't, but you need to keep that within the hands of the locals, because what you don't want is external factors coming in and saying, we're going to do social transformation of your area. And this is the whole thing with the data centers, how they want to blow up any state or local ability to keep them out, to keep out wind projects and things like that. So with this whole Section 8 thing, I mean, this has been a story even in my part of the country on the East Coast since I was a kid, how people feel like, wait a minute, I thought we had zoning in place. I thought I can't open up something that doesn't comport with the character of the area if I wanted to. But suddenly you hear, often late in the planning stages, you're going to have a high-rise, low-income complex in an area. They're like, wait a minute, this thing doesn't fit. How are they manipulating zoning to get this done?
Okay, so in Teton County, the federal government owns 97.5% of our county. It's in the form of National Parks and Forest Service. Then private conservation has conserved another 1.5%. So what you have is almost a golden ticket, okay? Now, in our town's case, they actually called a 40,000 square foot building with 48 units an accessory residential unit, because if they rezone the property from public use to high density housing, the town was ready to bring a referendum. The town didn't want to do this. So what they did is they subverted their own zoning process. It even says on the land use regulations on the county website that accessory residential unit is a garage apartment, a mother-in-law suite. But in this case, they called a 48 unit complex an accessory residential unit to skirt the zoning. Now in Casper, that Liberty Square Apartments piece of property with President Grover Cleveland, again, another Willy Wonka golden ticket. I see email after email where they're saying the Casper Housing Authority is going to build a 60-unit complex. We are going to bypass all zoning, all regulations. They don't go through the normal process because this is in the name of low-income housing for the Casper Housing Authority. But when I looked at the deed, when I finally got my hands on some of the contracts, the only thing the Casper Housing Authority has to do with any of this huge complex is they get paid 6% of the management fees. In other words, 94% of the rent is heading back to the East Coast and then on to Japan. But they,
so you're saying the same reason why they don't pay property taxes, they could also bypass zoning because this is not a private entity. This is the Public Housing Authority, even though they're just shunting it off to their often former employers.
I've had so many disgruntled former employees call me, and no one, this is a well-guarded secret. And that's why I want everybody in all 50 states to start looking at who really owns this housing. There is an article, I've linked it on openrangerecord.com. This guy named Matthew Friedrich with the New Republic, he wrote an investigative piece on this last year. And he basically said, what happens is they set up a complicated structure of LPs or LLCs. Then you have to go through an expensive process like I did. I spent thousands of dollars on legal fees out of my own pocket just trying to get my hands on the ownership documents for the buildings that don't pay property tax. Now, some of these buildings, I've identified 2 that cost $19 million to build. They should be paying about $110,000 a year. In 10 years, that's $1.1 million in lost revenue on property tax. And everybody's thinking that these buildings are owned by the Casper Housing Authority, Teton County Housing Authority. Only when you get the documents do you see 99.9% an East Coast equity firm or some out-of-state developer. Another thing I want to alert you to, Daniel, is this vicious cycle starts over every 15 years. You'll see the housing authority directors or concerned citizens all of a sudden saying, these buildings are in disarray. We need to refurbish these buildings. We need more federal tax credits to fix the buildings. It's not an accident that the building falls apart on 15 years on the dot. Why isn't it ever 13 years? Why isn't it 18 years? You know why? Because in 15 years, you get a whole nother round of funding, more development fees, more consulting fees, more syndicate fees, more middleman fees, more all these facilitators get paid out again. And so every 15 years, the cycle starts all over again.
So again, when you don't have to service a market, an organic market need, a market demand, so you don't have to have complexes and construct them and maintain them in a way that will be pleasing, because the consumer is not the consumer. The consumer is the taxpayer federal funding that is guaranteed to them regardless of how much they put into the building. So obviously you're going to put in as little as you can get away with. And that's how you have these slumlords. What I'm not understanding is I don't view your county as very much a high density, low income housing structure. What sort of people are they bringing in, and what sort of political agenda is there? Because while your state is red, the reddest in the nation, well, okay, the most Republican in the nation. Now, there's a lot of problems with those Republicans, but that county is often Democrat. How do you believe that, just like with the Somali welfare, this is always a conduit to empowering Democrat special interests or liberal special interests?
There's no doubt about it. We have a very weak man for governor here in Wyoming. Governor Gordon's, thank God, on his way out. So he wouldn't get to the bottom of this no matter what. It wouldn't honestly matter what I would uncover. I would have zero help from the governor's office. Okay. And he's aware of all of this. So in Teton County, we're considered the wealthiest county in America. It's more expensive to live here for housing than San Francisco. In that building that I referenced, thank God for Secretary of State Chuck Gray, okay? He filed, I was blowing such a whistle on these programs that he single-handedly filed an investigation into this building here in Jackson. And as a result, I got my hands on redacted tenant files, okay? I discovered that at first we got 15 of the files. 13 of the 15 did not qualify to be in the building. I disclosed a residents had $200,390 in their bank account moving into low-income housing. I actually met with that guy in person, and I was highlighting some of the examples, and to my amazement, the tenants would reach out to me and want to meet. Guess why? They know 10 examples worse than theirs in the building. This guy admitted he moved here from another state. The only way he qualified is by going on unemployment to move here. But what HUD's program and the IRS says is, let's say you have $100,000 in your savings account. We're going to call that at 5%. So really that's 5% of income per year. Can you believe that? That's how I found $75,000 vehicles in the parking lot. The developers actually called the cops on me because I blocked out the tags, but I was putting on Facebook on my page, how do we have $75,000 vehicles in what's considered the lowest income bracket in Teton County. Let me tell you something else I found thanks to Secretary of Gray. Some of the units were supposed to have people only making 30% of AMI. Now, who's in Teton County making $28,000 a year? They didn't say retired, they said working. When, the person that answers the phone at our rec center makes $54,000 a year. So who's making $28,000? You ready for the answer? A cash-based business. Every one of the files I got for the 30% were cleaning services, cleaning businesses, cash-based businesses.
Oh no.
Let me point out one other thing that I think is very important about this low-income housing tax credit program. Do not ever hear me or think I'm saying the word tax return to get qualified into the building. You do not need a tax return. You need 2 months of source documents. That means a paycheck stub. So if you went on vacation that month and you only worked half of the month and your paycheck is less than it should be, just submit that and give me 1 other month of source documents. I've literally seen where people wrote, I can't see what they wrote, but like a P&L, they just write it off by hand. It's not certified by anybody, nothing. The amount of marital fraud I've seen on these applications where someone says there's only one person moving into the unit. And they said, well, wait a minute, you're legally married. No, I'm not. Okay. They don't want to say 2 incomes. If they say 2 incomes, they don't qualify to get in the building. So every way you look at this, and y'all, if it's happening in Wyoming, I can't imagine if we look at these other states. One other thing I want to touch on is, can you imagine if you're just some guy that just got married and you're trying to afford to buy a house, and everywhere around you, your county or state or municipality is quote unquote donating money to these, what we now know are just private developers, East Coast equity firms. So they get free land, or in our case, a free 99-year lease. But all over the state, I've seen discounted land, free land, grants.
No property tax.
No property tax. And then the golden ticket as far as zoning. How are you going to compete with that? Land, there's only a finite amount of land. It's the only thing the government can't create more of. So in a place like Teton County, where most of the land's protected, and now we just go give an acre to a developer, that makes the price of everybody else's land go up again. How is that okay?
That's exactly what is fueling the housing bubble. I'm so glad you brought that up, because there's this dumb bipartisan Senate bill from the Senate Banking Committee between Tim Scott and Elizabeth Warren that takes every one of these programs, the subsidies, both for low-income people and for developers of low-income housing, and juices them up. More loan guarantees, more subsidies, more and they want to guide, they call it guidance now, just like Obama did, guidance on zoning, because they want more easy zoning for this. We don't need this, and this is exactly what's harming people. This is the circuitous cycle of welfare. The more we spend money and go into debt and print treasuries and to service the debt, the more inflation you have, the more you need these programs, because you can't afford. But again, in the meantime, on its way to the destination, just like with healthcare, just like with the childcare stuff with the Somalis in Minneapolis, it is being siphoned off by absolutely for-profit middlemen. It's the same. It's almost like the same playbook I'm watching with the green grift, with the data centers. It's the zoning favors. It's the property tax favors. It's the misallocation of federal capital to steer entire cottage industries. And again, I want to get back to the fundamental policy here, that when you go and incentivize state and local authorities to say you do not have to worry about a single dollar, so then your biggest concern is going to be making as many special interests happy so that they donate to your campaign and you're secure. Whereas if states had to sink or swim on their own volition, it's capped, it's block granted, and the feds are done. Now you have to balance the budget. Isn't that ultimately the solution? In addition to obviously some of these reforms, making sure that they pay, property taxes but even all this fraud is not a bug, but a feature to the fact that they don't care. They want it.
That's absolutely right. And I just want to encourage everybody listening, Daniel, One person can make a difference. My county assessor is not giving 2 buildings I've identified in Teton County an exemption this year. The Natrona County assessor, Tammy Salisbury, I've never even met her, but we've had some phone conversations. And she said, based on the information you've dug up, 4 of these buildings you've identified will not be getting an exemption this year. So one person can go around. Now, at the Wyoming Community Development Authority, I wish someone loved me like they love and protect Blue Line Development and these ravenous group of middlemen. They will not tell us what these people make. That would make my job a lot easier. If you have to trick the public or not disclose things to the public for their best interest, if we knew what they were getting paid, people would be flipping out. So what they're going to do is not tell us. But that's not the case in the rest of the states. The rest of the states are going to disclose this information. And I encourage your listeners to get to the bottom of this in their state. I also want to point out to be unaware of legislators or others that are actively helping these private developers. I never trust a woman that doesn't smile. Okay. We've got this state senator named Tara Nethercott. I mean, literally, she's always got a scowl on her face. But she tried to sponsor a bill in 2022 called Senate File 113. And it was going to automatically give a property tax exemption to every project the Wyoming Community Development Authority touched. Really wrap your head around that one. Who was she helping? Who was she trying to help there? She's going to redesign the state. She's trying to grease the wheels to get these projects on fast track. So look for stuff, and thank God the bill didn't pass, but look for things like that as well.
I gotta say, Rebecca, this is just, here's what rips my soul apart, because, you look at this social transformation. Let's just talk about the physicality of this. The protecting the Western heritage, replacing unique local architecture, single family ownership with these transient rental blocks, and, and obviously changing the voting block as well. That's obviously a big part of it. I look at this, and here's what I'm going to zoom out a little bit from this scam to the broader political dynamic. I think that is exemplified in the divide between Secretary of State Chuck Gray and the Governor Gordon, the Freedom Caucus in the legislature, and what they call the Wyoming caucus, which is really more the Boston caucus, the
Democrats within the Republican Party.
Yeah, as we see, is that, don't you take any pride in your state? This almost reminds me of these National Geographic videos of the lions or hyenas feasting from a buffalo. You have a state, and it's like they just view everything as a real estate deal. I wrote a whole article last year about the heartbreaking nature of every direction you go traveling outside of Casper, you're meeting these dystopian looking windmills. It's just whether it's the wind grift, now the data center grift that wants to take out as much water and power as the entire usage of Wyoming, and then the Section 8. It's like, have you no shame? Is there no soulfulness in your governance? Is there no, that's what I don't understand. Is everything just a pay for play scavenger hunt?
I wrote a letter to the editor here about defending and protecting our Western heritage. I just couldn't believe we were taking, when we get rid of these fairgrounds, it's a death by 1,000 cuts. The rodeo is about to be gone, folks. We've got 1 year left on the rodeo concessionaire contract. By the way, that's run by the Phil Wilson family. His grandmother was the first non-native born in this valley, came over in a covered wagon, okay? And they are running them out of town. And I wrote a letter to the editor, and one of the people listed on all the RFPs, Joe Rice, sent me a cease and desist. It said, don't mention my name with that project or I'm going to sue you for defamation. Why are you threatening me? If you're part of this problem, I'm going to hold you accountable. It's almost insulting that they grease the wheels to get these projects through, and then they pay their attorneys to try to intimidate citizens to not mention their name because they don't want any public association with these projects. I want to give you one quote by the Cato Institute. I'm going to read it for you. This is it. They said this to Congress. Low income tax credits can be a vehicle for state and local corruption because officials have discretion in handing out the lucrative credits. Yep. There is a reason this is not handled by elected officials, a public, transparent process. To touch on your point earlier, about the demographics in these buildings. There's another building, also a $20 million building in Casper, fully funded by taxpayer dollars, no transparency on what everybody's getting paid. I saw the police report for those buildings. We are talking about teenagers running around with knives trying to stab people. The amount of domestic violence, drug busts, how many literally
where are they coming
fugitives living in? They say they have active warrants. So and so's has a boyfriend barricaded in her apartment with active warrants for their arrest. I mean, these are not people in your neighborhood. We are importing, as President Trump would say, some of the most violent people around the country / world to move into low-income housing. They're not going to pay property tax. I actually saw where the developer in this exact building sent a letter to the city, said, help. We're not going to get our funding. The police said they're not going to respond to the building. We don't care how fast they respond. We don't care about the response time. But can you make sure the police is going to respond to the building so we can get our funding? I mean, come on. It's every way around this. This is not for the public good. The property taxes pay for those police responses. And they're saying, we're not going to pay property tax, but we need a letter that says you're going to respond to the building. And thank God the police are going over there, because you wouldn't believe the rap sheet for some of the tenants.
See, this is what a lot of people like me find very heartbreaking. And I know, actually, I could think of one former hopefully to be elected again, a representative in Wyoming, who came from out of state and reminds me of me, where I'm from a blue state. And I'm looking longingly towards a state like Wyoming. Man, I wish I could move there. But what a lot of people have found very heartbreaking, a lot of conservatives from blue states, they're like, okay, right to carry is a little bit better. There's some things that are a little better, but it's not as good as they thought. And it's like, from me, growing up outside of Baltimore, I would think of Casper as some hick town where you don't have any problems. And you're telling me you have crime problems, you have drug problems, and this is all the social transformation brought to you by people who have no pride in their heritage. Everything is a business deal for them. And by the way, you go ahead.
I was just going to say, ripping off the government is how they do business. I highly recommend everybody read the book by Ann Coulter. It's called Adios America. When the news, and I've seen this here in Jackson, the news will say a Texas man was arrested for drunk driving, no driver's license, no insurance, blah, blah, blah. Well, the Texas man just got here from El Salvador, okay? Or they say a Jackson man. They won't tell you his name. But the people that you're going to see busted in some of these police calls, you would not recognize them as neighbors 10, 15 years ago. So that's one of the scams. And then I don't want to get off the subject, but we in Wyoming, we have a top 5 elected officials, and some of them have actually, unfortunately, the conservatives lost the vote to fund some of these buildings with state dollars. Well, I just recently saw an email from Superintendent of Education Megan Degenfelder, who's just recently announced she's running for governor. She emails the WCDA and says, I'm getting a lot of pushback from the citizens. Can you tell me what these guys are getting paid? The WCDA executive director wrote back and said, for $100 a document, but we're going to redact all the fees, we'll provide it to you. Can you believe that? The Secretary of Education, Superintendent of Education, one of the top 5 officials in the state, is saying how much these people get paid. The state's funding the programs, and they're saying you're going to need to pay $100 per document, and we're going to redact all the fees. Let us know if you want to move forward. The audacity of these programs, these enriching these developers. This is, folks, we don't have to take it. We have the power to stop this.
You have the power to stop it. And I love what you're doing, just to end off here, to zoom out of just this low-income housing scam, but just in general. I love your Eyes on Wyoming program, where we think of town halls as elected officials holding town halls. No, you as a private citizen, you hold town halls. Your enemies come. The lawyers for the developers come. Some local officials that are on our side, Freedom Caucus guys come. Chuck Gray comes, and local citizens come, and you just lay it all out. It was amazing. You did a 1.5-hour event, and I think this is the blueprint. Could you point to any resource? I don't know if you've done this yet, of a little bit of a how-to, or do you have any article that you've written that I could point to where people could take in their state as a launching point when they're concerned about, all this Section 8 going up out of nowhere and being very unnatural, what they could start digging into?
So if you drive by or drive around your town and you see a little sign that says, funded by HUD, low income housing, when you start seeing those signs, I want you to go home and look up the property tax bill. Okay. If they're not paying property tax and the owner is in the name of an LLC or LP, you assume it's going to be your housing authority. But if it's not, you're on to something. Now, it helps. Like when I discovered they had called the cops on me, Nate Richmond, Nate Shepard, one of the developers that called the cops on me from Montana. And I thought, who's acting like this? That's when I started stumbling into they don't pay property tax. Senator Sherry Steinmetz here in Wyoming, she sent a letter to the assessor and said, wait a minute, how are these people not paying property tax? It helps if you do have someone like Secretary of State Chuck Gray or Senator Sherry Steinmetz. But I got so far just by myself disclosing this stuff. So check out openrangerecord.com. My email is Rebecca Bextel at gmail.com, Bextel. I'd be happy to help anybody figure out how to stop this scam in their state.
Rebecca Bextel, BXTL at Gmail.
Yep.
At gmail.com. Folks,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, if you're having this in your place, and I know we have some local officials, county councilmen who listen to this show. So if this is something that's bothering you, you want to dig into this, you might not be aware of it, or you're not sure how to go about dealing with this. This sits at the nexus of the future of red state land, the quality of life, inflation, the circuitous cycle of Democrat and Rhino power sources that degrade the quality of life to enrich their cronies. This really is much bigger than just, some deep blue areas in Minneapolis with Somalis. This is happening in every red state, with a myriad of programs. But again, it's the housing one it's the most physical infrastructure that does affect you more than, let's say, food programs would. So this is something in many respects that's worse than the Somali food scandal. So again, openrangerecord.com. God bless you, Rebecca, for what you're doing. Never stop fighting, never back down. And we look forward to having you back again.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Thank you for hammering this. And I will be getting those development fees out of the WCDA. So let me know if you want me back and we can talk about who's getting paid and how much.
Give him hell.
Thank you very much for having me.
Take care. So, folks, again, that was Rebecca Bextel. You could find her at that Open Range Record site, and you could see how she goes about doing this. But again, I just want to end off by saying this is not just about one individual welfare program. This is really what it means to take back government one town, one county at a time. Good luck in trying to get the feds to change. I mean, look, I'm going to advocate Trump block grant to the states and, devolve all these programs. I don't think I'm going to be very successful. So you got to really do this bottom up. Stop being gaslit that all that matters is Congress and the presidential election 50 million years away. If you have a red area where the people broadly agree with you, you can get a lot done. But if you don't start raising hell as to what's going on, just know that 99% of the time your Republican local officials are not working for you. And folks, until tomorrow, God bless you all. And that's just the way it is.